Hello. This is a special episode of the Liberation Chronicles. I'm Robin Parker. Recently, my organization, the Beyond Diversity Resource Center, hosted a workshop in a series called Radical Attention, Extraordinary Mindfulness for Social Justice. The first workshop featured the meditation I'm about to read. One I wrote to inspire a conversation about the recent attacks on social justice efforts. I offer a rereading here in the hopes of inspiring further conversation. The meditation is called Grieving the Attacks on Social Justice. Are you breathing? In her poems, Nikki Giovanni captures the mood of meditation and rebellion simultaneously. For those of you who know her, you know. For those of you who need an introduction to the poet, activist, writer, educator, let me say that she passed in December 2024, and that you should read and listen to Nikki when you have the chance. She created poetry that looked deeply into the Black soul, and turned all that pain into poems that said, in the words of the African-American spiritual, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." Because of Nikki, you knew that was true. And you also knew the real deal was people who oppress me don't care about the trouble I've seen. But this is what it feels like to let them know anyway. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. This meditation, this shot in the dark, this plea to the transcendent power that moves you is dedicated to Nikki and by extension to all of us. Yes, all of us. This meditation is written in her style, with sincere thanks to her and all the Black women who taught me how to mourn losses. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And I think Nikki would have laughed about my saying all of us. Not because she would have thought that being inclusive was a bad idea, but because, as she said in one of her poems, there are so many new mistakes that can be made, it shouldn't be necessary to repeat the old ones. And although she was reflecting on a woman who was an older sex worker who lived in her building, the quiet subversiveness in giving a dignified voice to a woman whose society had cast aside provokes the same daring as inviting white people and Black people, men and women, straight people and LGBTQ people, liberals and conservatives, haters and lovers, believers and non-believers, saints and sinners, shit kickers and shit talkers, even cats and dogs, to come together across that great gulf, perhaps the Gulf of America, that has been built across differences. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And when he descended the escalator with his trademark overly long red tie, and Melania, who was just overly everything, accompanied him, we were told that he would be the greatest jobs president that God had ever created. And while we now know, in hindsight, that wasn't true, we also now certainly know that he didn't care whether that was true or not. And in a world where people don't care about the truth, they certainly don't care about other people, especially those they can demonize, like the Mexicans, who were responsible for all the drugs and the murders and the raping, except for some good Mexicans who the border guards on the Rio Grande had never met. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And oh, how the mighty were falling, including 1. Lying Ted Cruz, whose father never met Lee Harvey Oswald, but who, through the help of Photoshop and the influence of Donald Trump, found himself distributing flyers with Oswald in the pages of the National Enquirer anyway. 2. Little Marco Rubio, who was not only little, but too sweaty for the job of president, but not so sweaty that he could not later become the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor during the second administration that we hoped would never happen. Wonders never cease. 3. Low Energy Jeb. 4. Elizabeth Pocahontas Warren. 5. John, not a war hero, McCain. 6. Ben, like a child molester, Carson. 7, 8, 9, and 10. Carly, look at that face, Fiorina. No sexism intended, of course, but only attractive people can be leaders. Not nasty women like Carly Fiorina, Hillary Clinton, or Nancy Pelosi. And certainly not nasty women like Megyn Kelly, who made the mistake of asking uncomfortable questions and in return received uncomfortable character assassinations about blood coming out of her eyes. And had it been left there, it would have been bad enough, but it wasn't left there. And truthfully, the only thing left to say is what my mother always said in such situations. Lord, have mercy. So we got the announcement that in this new, old world, where America was great again, that you could grab women by the genitals if you were a celebrity. And not only that, you could convince yourself that they liked it, not because you had any evidence that was the case, and certainly not because the statistics on sexual assault supported you, but simply because you said so. And after all that, you could claim that you didn't remember saying anything at all. Fake news? Table for 340 million? Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. So Kellyanne Conway introduced alternative facts to Americans about the size of the inauguration. Everything was the biggest and the best, the claims of Stormy Daniels notwithstanding. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And although the administration didn't like Mexico, they did like the Mexico City policy that blocked funding of NGOs that provided abortion counseling, referrals, or services. And speaking once again of Mexicans, which we must do interminably, although nobody asked Mexicans, they were going to pay to build a wall on the southern border of the United States to keep the bad people out like the Libyans, Syrians, and Somalians. No. They were not the good people like National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI, but got a get-out-of-jail-free card. Can pardons be used to remove the grit and polish from a tongue darkened by too much bootlicking? Not like James Comey, who announced an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. Apparently, Hillary should have used the Signal app, a lesson Pete Hegseth would teach years later. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And how could we forget the first impeachment evidence, which showed that Trump used his influence to get Ukraine to open a specious probe into Joe Biden? Or Sharpiegate, with Hurricane Dorian not hitting Alabama. Oh, Song of the South, a sweet potato pie and I shut my mouth. Or outreach to despots like Kim Jong-un, or Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or Vladimir Putin, or Rodrigo Duterte, who, incidentally, was doing an unbelievable job on the drug problem in the Philippines, killing over 12,000 people in vigilante violence. Or Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who was found in contempt of court for failing to follow a federal court order to stop racial profiling Latinx drivers in Maricopa County, Arizona. We wondered whether he got his presidential pardon, A, because he was a bigot, B, because his office unfairly targeted Latinx people, C, because he continued to claim that Barack Obama's birth certificate was forged, or D, all of the above. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. We wondered if we could take a breath in December 2019 when the COVID pandemic began. But with the help of disinfectant, UV lighting, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, the absence of face masks, and the presence of school prayer, we could manage the virus, that Kung flu, that China virus. So they cut aid to New York City because someone had daddy issues and needed a hug. Yet we kept it together while the morgues filled, while colossal pyres burned next to the Ganges, and Chinese Americans, another real enemy of the state, were assaulted in our streets. And drag queens across America read books with forewords that exclaimed, "Bitch, please. Nobody wants to inject you with a microscopic tracking device. You're a dishwasher at the Cracker Barrel, and everybody knows everything they need to know about your sad, sorry ass." They would later be banned by legislatures in Tennessee, Montana, North Dakota, Arkansas, Texas, and Florida because of their audacity. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. But before we could wonder more about COVID, we learned that the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville had very fine people on both sides, especially if you weren't the people run down by white supremacists. But we learned that someone had to pay for it all. Pay for the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee following the Charleston, South Carolina church massacre in which a white supremacist killed 9 members of a black church. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. We thought the tables were turning when the murder of George Floyd was caught on a camera not being used to take selfies in Minneapolis. That somehow the cold, detached knee of a white police officer asphyxiating the life out of a black man who cried for his mother might be enough. That all the protesting and the mattering of black lives and the murder of countless others and the call for police reform and the installation of Black Lives Matter Plaza meant that perhaps the revolution would be televised and America might be best, as Melania Trump suggested. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. But we learned that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And that the looting is done by the bad people, and the shooting is done by the good people who wear paramilitary outfits, admire the Third Reich, carry tiki torches, and say that Jews will not replace us. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. We also learned that breaking into the Capitol is not looting when you're trying to make America great again, and that you can call for the death of the vice president, break down the windows at the seat of government, and shoot pepper spray at the police, exercising your God-given rights to protest, all in the name of making America great again. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And then, hallelujah, he was out of office, but not out of our lives. The creeping, crawling depravity of it all kept on coming through indictments, arrests, and endless tweets. And they tasted blood when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And Clarence Thomas wondered, since Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben had gone the way of Topsy, Little Black Sambo, and Step and Fetch It, whether the state should have the power to outlaw interracial marriage, or the marriage of anyone who could not have been married when the Constitution was drafted. Astonishing irony, table for two? Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And we wondered, even if we were non-believers, whether Jesus would take the wheel. Who knew it would be the wheel of a Tesla for sale on the White House lawn? We cried for Joe, we cried for Kamala, but in the end, all we could do was cry for ourselves. Mercy, mercy, mercy. So our cries were answered with over 100 executive orders, including ones abolishing the constitutional right to be a citizen if you were born in America, and the Department of Education, and due process of law, and anything that sounded like that woke mob, commie, socialist, radical, Black Lives Matter, DEI, critical race theory, monkey business. Yes, monkey business, you woke mobsters. Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. Yes, there was a new sheriff in town, and he was the old sheriff in town, and this time he was going to do it his way. And his way was a one-way plane ticket to a prison in El Salvador, and round-trip tickets to tariffs, and an astonishing clarification on the topic of what witch hunts really look like. But while witches were defying gravity, only Donald Trump could defy 2 assassination attempts and the federal courts. Unlike Dorothy, who had ruby red slippers to take her home after visiting the wizard, his supporters were offered golden, limited edition victory sneakers for $499, with Trump won 45-47 emblazoned on the sole, and Fight, Fight, Fight perfume for $199 with delicate floral notes and a burst of citrus. Does it smell like oranges and regret? Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on. And so, as we mourn our losses, as we wonder about things like how far it all has to go before we can call it a constitutional crisis, or whether we're passengers on a Death Star that will conquer the enemy planets of Greenland, Canada, and Panama, or whether they're eating our dogs, and eating our cats, and eating the pets of the people who live here, we are forced to confront an awful question. How do we live with it all? Have you taken a breath? Are you breathing? If you are, take a breath with me before we go on.